The plane you're seeing is landing in Moscow. It's a United States Air Force C-17A Globemaster, and on board is none other than CIA Director John Ratcliffe. This past Tuesday, 25th of August, the head of US Foreign Intelligence made a surprise visit to the Russian capital. He did so without prior notice. No one was expecting this trip, and this is by no means a common occurrence. The CIA and the Russian Secret Services are two bitter enemies. For 70 years, they've been trying to recruit each other, steal secrets, and plant spies. So obviously, the head of US intelligence turning up in Moscow is by no means an everyday occurrence. It's highly unusual. In fact, it was John Ratcliffe's first visit of this kind. And not only that, but to top it all off, this guy is considered the most pro-Ukraine figure in the entire Trump administration. His role has been crucial, for example, in maintaining and strengthening intelligence exchanges with Kyiv, something vital to the long-range attack campaign currently being waged by the Ukrainians. In other words, it's hard to imagine anyone more of a thorn in Putin's side. So naturally, the fact that someone like him, in his position, suddenly showed up in Moscow by surprise has set off all the alarms. Why and for what purpose did the head of the CIA have to make an urgent trip to Moscow? What on earth does this mean? Does it have anything to do with the escalating tensions we've seen in recent days in the Black Sea, in Ukraine, and in Kaliningrad itself? Well, in this video, we're going to look at the reasons that might explain this visit, the reasons that really matter, and that we all need to understand to figure out what exactly is going on. And take note, because we're not just talking about Ukraine here. We're also talking about the Baltics, NATO, terrorist activities, and even Iran. In fact, have you noticed that in the hours following the CIA director's visit to Moscow, the price of crude oil has plummeted? Well, pay attention, because even that may be closely related to this entire situation. VisualPolitik community, listen carefully to everything we're about to tell you, because tensions are running red hot. But first, if you're interested in the world of investing, if you want to learn how to manage your savings, protect yourself against inflation, and figure out how to make money beyond your day job, I've got some good news for you. Here at Visual Factory, we have created the Visual Factory Club, a newsletter where every week we send out free content focused on essential financial education, the ABC of what everyone should know to understand the stock market, financial markets in general, investment platforms, how to assess investment opportunities, and which markets may have more or less potential. Because of course, if you want to invest your money so you're not at the mercy of your country's economic instability, you at least need to understand the basics of the financial world. In the Visual Factory Club, you will learn all of this completely free of charge. Through the link below and this QR code, you can sign up for the club and start receiving the upcoming editions. What's more, when you sign up, you'll receive a dossier where I explain in a clear and simple way the most essential investment concepts, what multiples or the PE ratio are, what indices are, ETFs, derivatives, funds, EPS, you get the idea. After that, every week you'll receive additional materials and market analysis to help you stay informed about what's going on. And by the way, the sooner you sign up, the better, since we send each episode of the series by email and every edition is unique. If you're not subscribed, you might miss some of them and you won't be able to access them later. But with that said, let's get into the video. On the 2nd of November 2021, remember this date, a US government plane landed in Moscow with a passenger who, in theory, was not supposed to set foot in that city. I'm talking about Bill Burns, a man who had served as US ambassador to Russia from 2005 to 2008, who spoke Russian and who knew most of Putin's inner circle personally, and who, at that time, was none other than the director of the CIA. During that whirlwind visit to Moscow, Burns met with Nikolai Patrushev, secretary of the Russian Security Council, with Sergei Naryshkin, head of the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service, and he even spoke with Vladimir Putin himself. What did they talk about? Why did he go to Moscow? Essentially, it was to deliver a message, or rather, to issue a warning to the Russians, because Joe Biden sent him to Moscow on a very specific mission, to convey to the Kremlin's top brass that Washington knew exactly what they were plotting, that it was aware of their plans and intentions. What intentions are we referring to? Well, remember the date of the visit, November 2021. So obviously, we're talking about the invasion of Ukraine. Biden sent the CIA director himself at the time of peak tension to tell the Russians not to go through with it. If they dared to take that step, they would face serious consequences, including US support for the Ukrainian resistance. And now, we've just witnessed a similar trip being repeated. A trip that also took place, as we'll see, at a time of peak tension. And to top it all off, as I mentioned earlier, it was led by the man who is currently considered the most pro-Ukraine figure in the entire Trump administration. But once again, Ukraine. Why is it so surprising for an intelligence director to visit Moscow? Well, let's see. CIA members and officials are, basically, spies, with all that entails. In other words, this isn't about diplomacy, it's the dirty side of international politics. The outcome? When the agency's director himself takes charge of the talks and shows up in a foreign country, he usually does so because he wants to convey an extremely sensitive message, because he has to do it directly without relying on telecommunications, and because he can't risk the message being misinterpreted. In other words, we're essentially talking about critical moments. So of course, with all this in mind, the logical question is, what on earth was this director doing in Russia and why? Well, we're going to answer that question, but first, in order to understand this story, we can't overlook everything that's been happening in recent weeks. We can summarize this in 4 main points. First, Russia's situation on the front lines is rapidly deteriorating. According to estimates from the Ukrainian General Staff, in July alone, Russia lost more than 40,000 men, including those killed and wounded. It was the bloodiest month so far in 2026. And although these are Ukrainian estimates, the truth is that virtually no one denies that Russia is suffering like never before, and that it is losing units at a breakneck pace. And we're not even just talking about troops. The Ukrainians also destroyed more than 2,000 artillery systems, nearly 14,000 vehicles, and more than 54,000 drones. July was madness, and August isn't turning out any better. Things on the front lines are going from bad to worse, and they're achieving practically nothing in the process. Because in July, despite all those immense losses, the Russians barely managed to occupy 37 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. That's just over 1 kilometer squared per day. They're suffering massive casualties for nothing. A second point we cannot overlook: Ukraine is carrying out increasingly daring attacks within Russia itself, which is severely eroding the government's popularity. For the first time, Russians are witnessing large-scale explosions on their own soil. And that changes everything. The war is no longer just something happening in another country. The Ukrainians are blowing up warehouses on a massive scale. You know, the famous ones like Wildberries, Russia's largest e-commerce platform, but also oil refineries, fuel depots, and energy facilities of all kinds. It's non-stop. For instance, they recently dealt a heavy blow to the Kustovo refinery, the 4th largest in all of Russia and crucial for supplying the Moscow region. The situation is so crazy that lines at gas stations are becoming the new normal.
Russia runs out of gasoline at 7 out of 10 stations as the fuel crisis worsens.
And not surprisingly, all of this explains why more than 60% of Russians now want the war to end once and for all. Third, we've learned that Ukraine's allies, particularly the United Kingdom and France, are beginning to share their missile technology with the Ukrainian military-industrial complex so that it can start manufacturing much more advanced equipment, which of course will eventually lead, if the war doesn't end, to even more ferocious attacks on Russian territory.
UK will help Ukraine make long-range missiles by sharing classified tech information.
As you can imagine, this has really pissed off the Russians.
Russia threatens to attack British factories.
And fourth, there's NATO itself, as we mentioned in our latest video here on VisualPolitik. Recently, NATO has conducted major military exercises around Kaliningrad, practically a full-scale electronic warfare drill, where they've showcased their most advanced capabilities. And that, well, that was just the latest move. European countries are ramping up their military spending. Finland, the Baltic republics, and Poland are fortifying their borders. And as you've just seen, support for Ukraine isn't waning. The result? Russia's relative position is deteriorating, something that, obviously, the Kremlin doesn't like one bit. Well, this is precisely the context in which the head of the US intelligence paid his visit to Moscow. What was the purpose? Well, no details have emerged yet, but we're just over 2 months away from the United States elections, and at a very unusual moment with many open fronts and many cracks in Washington. So we can clearly identify 3 major issues that the CIA director almost certainly had on his agenda. Listen up. VisualPolitik community, things are getting ugly. Just a few days ago, new assessments from US intelligence painted a disturbing picture. Just as they did in 2021, US intelligence agencies are issuing a warning. In their view, Vladimir Putin is seriously considering testing NATO's resolve and cohesion, escalating tensions, and securing concessions by forcing an even more delicate negotiation. How might he go about doing this? Well, according to US intelligence, the possibility of launching a limited attack against an allied country country is on the table. That is, against a NATO country. Specifically, they suggest that the Russians are preparing this action to be carried out sometime within the next 3 years, especially if the situation in Ukraine continues to deteriorate. We're talking about acts of hybrid warfare, the deployment of non-uniformed troops, or even a limited military incursion on the Atlantic Alliance's eastern flank. And I must stress, this is important. We are not the ones saying this. This is the warning that US intelligence agencies are now issuing for the first time. And I say for the first time because up until now, Washington considered this to be extremely unlikely, that Putin would never dare to directly challenge NATO. However, it appears this view began to shift early this year, when Russia's situation on the front lines became much more precarious, which makes sense. If things are going badly for you, you have to find a way to change the game. And, of course, hybrid warfare can be a great way to do that. Think about it. It's cheap, it doesn't require a massive mobilization of resources, and it doesn't automatically lead to all-out war. In other words, you can ramp up tensions while keeping costs somewhat in check. Well, here we can point above all to a possible attack on critical facilities and infrastructure, power plants, ports, refineries, airports, oil pipelines, gas storage facilities, and so on and so forth. For example, just recently here on VisualPolitik, we told you how, just a few days ago, a Romanian Air Force F-16 had to shoot down a Russian-launched maritime drone near Neptune Deep, a gas field currently under development that, starting next year, will make Romania the largest producer in the European Union. By the way, so you don't miss out on things like this, if you're still part of that 40% of viewers who aren't subscribed to the channel, now's the perfect time to do it. Just one click and you're all set. And if you give us a like, that'd be great. These are really small gestures that honestly help the channel out a lot. Now, check this out.
Romanian jet shoots down drone near offshore gas platform. President blames Moscow. This is hybrid warfare, European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen says.
In fact, Russian provocations have continued to escalate in recent months. This includes sabotage operations and explosions at military production facilities in Italy and Bulgaria. And it's far from trivial. All of this is causing so much concern that it's actually what led NATO to carry out the show of force around Kaliningrad that I mentioned earlier. Well, given that US intelligence considers this a very high risk and that action could be imminent, it's highly possible that John Ratcliffe's trip was intended to deter them. Of course, this isn't the only reason we can identify. We've also covered this here on VisualPolitik. Russia is running short on troops. So it's very possible that, after the Russian elections, scheduled for September 18th to 20th, the Kremlin will announce a general mobilization. This would be another step toward further escalating the conflict now that bombings have reached the very heart of the motherland. In other words, we're talking about putting all of Russia on a war footing. Basically, an all-or-nothing gamble. According to many reports, this would also include additional North Korean troops, between 30,000 and 50,000, and even the use of tactical nuclear weapons as a way to try to turn the tide. In recent weeks, this rumor has been growing louder, and that would clearly become the Trump administration's biggest international policy disaster. You know, going from ending the war in 2024 to letting it spiral completely out of control. Paranoia would spread across half the world, and any negotiations would become impossible. So it's highly likely that the CIA director has also sought to directly pressure Russian leaders to prevent the situation from escalating further. And finally, take a look at this news item.
Russia helps Iran rebuild war arsenal through the Caspian Sea.
The war in Iran has become a real dead end for the Trump administration, which sees the midterm elections approaching without any substantial improvement in the situation, and without the Iranians giving in. And as you've seen, it's well known that Russia is helping Iran, that Moscow is providing them with military assistance, intelligence support, target identification, and commercial supplies essential for their resistance. So the trip may have been aimed precisely at negotiating some kind of agreement, some sort of give and take, to get Moscow to stop supporting or pressuring Iran in exchange for some kind of compensation, perhaps to put a stop to Ukraine's long-range attacks. And keep in mind that the visit took place just one day after Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced Operation Economic Marginalization, a new offensive aimed at trying to bring the Iranians to their knees. In any case, just a few hours after the visit, a massive number of short positions were opened on crude oil, and rumours began to circulate, citing alleged sources in Pakistan, and this time, Russia as well, that a deal with Iran might be imminent, which automatically caused prices to plummet. Because if Russia is involved, the agreement seems more likely. In fact, some sources in Moscow say that's exactly what the CIA director asked of them, their cooperation in bringing Iran to heel. Of course, those same sources also say that the Russians flatly refused. In any case, as you can see, Moscow's role here seems particularly significant, and with the election clock already ticking, the administration is starting to get desperate. So, well, these are the three issues most likely to explain a visit as unusual as the one we've just witnessed. But of course, we're also talking about the Trump administration where nothing is normal. So obviously, anything is possible. What's clear is that tensions are running high. The question we're asking you today is, what do you think explains the CIA director's trip to Moscow? Tell us what you think down in the comments, and let's start the discussion. But first, if you like the video, remember to give us a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything coming up, because oh boy, there's a lot coming up. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. We really appreciate it. All the best. I'll see you in the next one.